My Lords, with the leave of the House, I shall now repeat a statement made yesterday by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, in the other place. The statement is as follows. I would like to make a statement about the proposed expansion of Heathrow Airport. This government has a clear vision to build a Britain that is fit for the future, a Britain with a prosperous jobs market and an economy that works for everyone. That is why I come to this House to mark an historic moment. Today, I am laying before Parliament our final proposal for an airport's national policy statement, which signals our commitment to securing global connectivity, creating tens of thousands of local jobs and apprenticeships, and boosting our economy for future generations by expanding Heathrow Airport. It is an example of how this government is taking forward its industrial strategy. Mr. Speaker, you know taking such a decision is never easy. This issue has been debated for half a century. My department has met with local residents and fully understands their strength of feeling, but this is a decision taken in the national interest and based on detailed evidence. In 2015, the Independent Airports Commission concluded that a new northwest runway at Heathrow was the best scheme to deliver additional capacity. And in October 2016, we agreed. We ran 2 national consultations during 2017 and received more than 80,000 responses. All the points raised have been carefully considered, and today we are publishing the government's response. To ensure fairness and transparency, we appointed an independent consultation advisor, the former Court of Appeal Judge, Sir Jeremy Sullivan. Our draft NPS was scrutinised by the Transport Committee, and I'd very much like to thank the chair of that committee and her team on that committee for all of the work that they did today, the thoroughness of that work, and I'm very pleased that they, like me and my colleagues in government, accepted the case for expansion and concluded that we are right to pursue development through an additional runway at Heathrow. We welcome and have acted upon 24 out of 25 of their recommendations. Our response to the committee is also being published today. Mr. Speaker, this country has one of the largest aviation sectors in the world, contributing £22 billion to our GDP, supporting 500,000 jobs, servicing 285 million passengers and transporting 2.6 million tonnes of freight last year. The time for action is now. Heathrow is already full, and the evidence shows the remaining London airports won't be far behind. Despite being the busiest 2-runway airport in the world, Heathrow's capacity constraints means it is falling behind its global competitors, impacting the UK's economy and global trading opportunities. Expansion at Heathrow will bring real benefits across the country, including a boost of up to £74 billion to passengers and the wider economy, providing better connections to growing world markets and increasing flights to more long-haul destinations. Heathrow is a nationally significant freight hub, carrying more freight by value than all other UK airports combined. A third runway would enable it to nearly double its current freight capacity. In addition, Mr. Speaker, and this is really crucial, this is a project which benefits that reach far beyond London. We expect and intend up to 15% of slots from a new runway to facilitate domestic connections across the United Kingdom, spreading the benefits of expansion to our great nations and regions. As well as new routes, I would expect there to be increased competition on existing routes, giving greater choice to passengers. And I say very clearly, the regional connectivity is one of the key reasons for the decision that we have taken. Now, I recognise the strong convictions many members of this House and their constituents have on this issue and the impacts on those living in the local area. It is for this reason that we have included strong mitigations in the NPS to limit these impacts. Communities will be supported by up to £2.6 billion towards compensation, noise insulation and improvements to public amenities, 10 times bigger than under the 2009 third runway proposal. This package is comparable with some of the most generous in the world and includes £700 million for noise insulation for homes and £40 million to insulate schools and community buildings. The airport has offered 125% of the full market value for homes in the compulsory and voluntary purchase zones, plus stamp duty, moving costs and legal fees, as well as a legally binding noise envelope and more predictable periods of respite. For the first time ever, we expect a 6.5-hour ban on scheduled nights flights. But my ambitions do not stop there. If this House agrees and the NPS is designated and the scheme progresses, I will be encouraging Heathrow and airlines to work with local communities to propose longer periods of respite during a further consultation on night flight restrictions. We will only grant development consent, Mr Speaker, if we are satisfied that a new runway would not impact the UK's compliance with air quality obligations. Advances in technology also mean new planes are cleaner, greener and quieter than the ones they are replacing. Earlier this year, a community engagement board was established and appointed Rachel Seffontein as its independent chair. It will focus on building relations between Heathrow and its communities, considering the design of the Community Compensation Fund, which could be worth up to £50 million a year, and also holding the airport to account when it comes to delivering on its commitments today and into the future. Mr Speaker, there has been much debate about the costs of this scheme. Our position on this could not be clearer. Expansion will be privately financed. But also, again crucially, Mr Speaker, expansion must also remain affordable to customers, to consumers. We took a firm step when I asked the industry regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, to ensure the scheme remains affordable while meeting the needs of current and future passengers. This process has already borne fruit with the identification of potential savings of up to £2.5 billion. I am confident that the process can and should continue. and that further cost savings can be identified, and that the design of expansion can continue to evolve to better reflect the needs of consumers. That is why I have recommissioned the Civil Aviation Authority to continue to work with industry to deliver the ambition I set out in 2016 to keep landing charges at or close to current levels. This will include gateway reviews, independent scrutiny and benchmarking of proposals, which I know are of paramount importance to British Airways, Virgin and the wider airline community. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to talk about scheme delivery and ownership. The North West Runway scheme put forward by Heathrow was selected by the government following a rigorous process. Since then, Heathrow have continued to make strong progress, having already consulted on their scheme design and airspace principles early this year. Some stakeholders have suggested that we should now look again at who delivers expansion. Whilst I, and we will always, retain an open mind, my current assessment is that caution is needed at this stage. Heathrow is an operational airport under a single management, and I am clear that they are currently the only credible promoter who could deliver this transformational scheme in its entirety. I welcome the Civil Aviation Authority's April consultation, which expects Heathrow to engage in good faith with third parties to ensure expansion is delivered in a way which benefits the consumer. However, this also needs to be balanced against the need for timely delivery, and that is why my department will be working closely with Heathrow to enable delivery of the new runway by their current target date of 2026. Heathrow is already, Mr Speaker, Britain's best connected airport by road and rail, and this will be further strengthened by future improvements to the Piccadilly line, new links to Heathrow through Crossrail, connections to HS2 via an interchange at Old Oak Common, and plans for Western and Southern rail access to the airport. I met on the 24th of May, Mr Speaker, with industry and financial backers who can potentially come forward with plans to deliver that new Southern rail access to the airport. Even with today's announcement, a new operational runway at Heathrow is still a number of years away. The Airports Commission recommended that there would also be a need for other airports to make more intensive use of their existing infrastructure, and we consulted on this in the Aviation Strategy Call for Evidence last year. So I'd like also today, apart from Heathrow, to confirm that the government is supportive of other airports making best use of their existing runways. However, we recognise that the development of airports can have negative as well as positive local impacts, including on noise levels. We therefore consider that any proposals should be judged on their individual merits by the appropriate planning authority, taking careful account of all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts. Furthermore, in April we set out our next steps, which will see us work closely with industry, business, consumer and environmental groups to develop an aviation strategy that sets out the long-term policy direction for aviation to 2050 and beyond, while addressing the changing needs and expectations of passengers. It will set out a framework for future sustainable growth across the UK, how we plan to modernise our congested airspace, how we plan to use innovative technology to deliver cleaner, quieter, quicker journeys for the benefit of passengers and communities. Airspace modernisation, Mr Speaker, has to be taken forward irrespective of the decision on the proposed new runway, and to do so we will expect multiple airports across the south of England to bring forward consultations on their own proposals on how to manage the airspace around their locations. Now, Mr Speaker, returning to Heathrow. The planning system involves two separate processes, One, to set the policy effectively outlining planning consent, which is our NPS, and then, if this House votes in favour of it, and it is then designated, a second process for securing the detailed development consent that the airport will require. So the next step would therefore be for Heathrow to develop their plans, including details of the scheme design and airspace change, and hold a further consultation to allow the public a further say on the next phase of Heathrow's plans and additional opportunities for the public to have their voices heard. Any application for development consent will of course be considered carefully and with an open mind, based on the evidence provided. The process includes a public examination by the Independent Planning Inspectorate before any final decision is made. Now, Mr. Speaker, alongside the NPS today, I have published a comprehensive package of materials that I hope and believe will enable members of this House to make an informed decision ahead of the vote. It's a very comprehensive package that I hope will provide answers to the questions that members will have. But I hope that the scheme and the House will feel that this scheme is crucial to our national interest, that we need to work together to deliver it in order to create what I believe is an absolutely vital legacy for the future of this country. Mr. Speaker, I hope members across the House will get behind this plan, support this nationally, strategically important project, and I commend this statement to the House.
My Lords, I'd like to thank the Minister for repeating the statement and providing the extensive documentation that went with it. My Lords, Labour's position on Heathrow was set out by my noble friend Andy MacDonald MP in the other place yesterday, and I will quote it. Labour will consider proposed expansion through the framework of our well-established four tests. Expansion should only happen if it can effectively deliver on the capacity demands, if noise and air quality issues are fully addressed, if the UK's climate change obligations are met in their entirety, and that growth across the country is supported. Labour's decision will emerge in due course. Turning to the statement, it says in the statement that to ensure fairness and transparency, we appointed an independent consultation advisor, the former Court of Appeal Judge Sir Jeremy Sullivan. I would invite the noble lady, the Minister, to set out a little more depth what the role of that individual was, whether it will continue into the future. Turning to the government's response to the Transport Committee report, recommendation 2 of their report is we recommend that both Houses of Parliament allow the planning process to move to the next stage by approving the airport's national policy statement, provided that the concerns we have identified later in our report are addressed by the government in the final NPS it lays before Parliament. My Lords, does that mean that in this House we will have a debate on a divisible motion? My Lords, turning back to the statement, it says, our draft NPS was scrutinised by the Transport Committee, and today I would like to thank the Chair and her committee for the thoroughness of their work. I was pleased that they, like me, accepted the case for expansion and concluded that we are right to pursue the development through an additional runway at Heathrow. We welcome and have acted upon 24 out of 25 of their recommendations. Other responses to the committee are also being published today. My Lords, for the avoidance of doubt, I will tell you that the 25th was recommendation 22, which was about an incinerator. But does they have acted upon mean we have agreed with the recommendation? Well, it clearly doesn't. If you turn to recommendation 19, the committee recommends that there should be a 7-hour noise ban at night, and the government has responded by saying, no, you're only going to get 6.5. I've done my best to try and understand the responses to the committee, and the responses are vague and at times woolly. Turning to the issue of the capacity, the statement says Expansion at Heathrow will bring real benefits across the country, including a boost of 74 billion to passengers and the wider economy, providing better connections to growing world markets and increasing flights to more long-haul destinations. My lords, that phrase sounds like thousands. In fact, quoting the committee's report, the MPS states that the NWR scheme is expected to lead to more long-haul flights and connections to fast-growing economies. The DfT's forecasts show that in the UK, at the UK level, the NWR scheme will offer one more destination overall to emerging and fast-growing economies when compared with no expansion. One seems a rather modest number. My lords, the statement touches upon savings. It says, we took a bold step when I asked the industry regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, to ensure the scheme remains affordable while meeting the needs of current and future passengers. This process has borne fruit with the identification of potential savings of up to £2.5 billion. My lords, is this saving coming from the mooted scheme, which I believe that Heathrow is consulting on, to reduce the length of the third runway from 3.5 kilometres to 3.2? And if it does, will there be any significant operational impact of that reduction? When, many years ago, I was privileged to be a co-pilot on 747s, 2,500 metres seemed enough, and certainly many of the operations presently at Heathrow have nothing like 3,500 metres in requirement. Given how expensive the N25 issue is to this scheme, are further reductions to the runway length being considered? Turning to air quality. Air quality is, we're more and more appreciating air quality, we're more and more appreciating its fatal consequences. So what is the commitment in air quality? There's a commitment in the statement, but there was another commitment in the government's response to the Transport Committee, and it said very solidly no scheme would be allowed to proceed. No scheme would be allowed to proceed if it did not comply with air quality obligations. Can the Minister flesh out what those air quality obligations are? My Lords, now turning to the issue of noise, once again the statement is fairly bullish about this. Communities will be supported by up to 2.6 billion towards compensation, noise insulation and improvements to public amenities, 10 times bigger than under the 2009 third runway proposal. That may be, my Lords, but Heathrow Airport Limited has recently proposed a cap of £3,000 on any insulation project, and anybody who has had their house insulated against noise knows that that is indeed a trivial sum. Can the noble Lord, the noble lady, the Minister, confirm that there will be no cap and Heathrow will pay what it takes to achieve the appropriate levels of noise insulation? Turning to the issue of the community, and it's a shame to see that the references to the community come right at the end of the document. I mean, it is the community that is going to be very, very impacted on this scheme. There is, towards the end of the document, earlier this year, a community engagement board was established and appointed Rachel Centine as its independent chair. It will focus on building relations between Heathrow and its communities, considering the design of the Community Compensation Fund, which could be worth £50 million a year, and holding the airport to account when it comes to delivering its commitments today and into the future. My Lords, could the noble lady set out what powers she will have? Will she, in fact, be acting something like a tribunal and be able to direct Heathrow in disputes to actually provide the appropriate money?
Lords, this statement has an air of Alice in Wonderland about it. The government's been considering this problem for 20 years, and I'm afraid the question is out of date, and so is the answer, because hub airports are no longer the growth area in aviation. The growth area is now in direct long-haul flights. And the idea of concentrating ever more development in the overcrowded southeast will, the government say, benefit other parts of the UK as well. Yet the report by the Economic Foundation, Flying Low, shows that a new runway at Heathrow will cost regional airports 14 million passengers a year. It'll harm them, not benefit them. The first bit of lack of reality is the timescale. 2026 is ridiculously optimistic. The idea that you are going to build a runway as well as demolish 800 houses, move an incinerator, deal with a public inquiry, deal with development consent, and, I am fairly certain, deal with challenges in the courts from local councils, really suggests to me that the government hasn't got realistic expectations in that regard. And that's important because it has a big impact on the ability for any airport development to help our trade situation. There's also a level of fictional economics, which is that the government has assigned a zero cost to this, saying it's a private development. Well, I would like to ask the Minister if she could clarify transport with her attitude to Transport for London's estimate of £6 billion cost to the public purse for public transport, and who will pay for the cost of the disruption of the M25 and the M4. There is a very, and I greatly regret, there is a very brief paragraph on air quality. We were hardly aware of emissions issues when this problem was first investigated. And I would like to ask the Minister, could she provide us with more detail on how this development will enable the government's compliance with international obligations on this? And would you particularly address the issue of surface transport access and surface transport within the airport? This is supposed to be a national statement, my lords, yet there is only one brief paragraph anywhere in it that that refers to anywhere other than the southeast of England. So I ask the Minister, how does the government intend to achieve their promise of supporting other airports to make best use of their runways? Is that a concrete promise of support, or is this simply wishing them well in the process? Because what I believe the government should be doing, and what we as Liberal Democrats believe, is that they should be using airport development as a springboard for the development and prosperity of the North and the Midlands. They should be spreading the prosperity across the whole country. And finally, can I make a warning here to everyone who is interested in this to look carefully at the wording in this statement, especially on page 2. All the reassurances are couched in what I would call weasel words. We expect, and I quote, we expect up to 15% of slots will facilitate domestic connections. What exactly does that promise to the other parts of the UK? The government expects up to 2.6 billion of compensation to be paid. Not at least 2.6 billion, but up to. We expect a 6.5-hour ban on scheduled night flights. So my final question to the Minister is, what exactly are the guarantees not the government's expectations, but the guarantees on compensation and night flight bans.
My Lords, I will attempt to get through all the questions. If I don't reach all of them, I will follow up in writing. The Noble Lord Tunnicliffe asked around the consultation advisor, Sir Jeremy Sullivan. He reviewed the government's consultation process, provided challenge to ministers and officials, and to ensure that it was at a high standard. He produced 2 reports which had been published, but the role was on the government consultation, so that has now been completed. On the TSC comment on approval of the MPS, Noble Lords debated the draft MPS on the 15th of March and the formal scrutiny period ended on the 23rd of March. The proposed airports MPS is subject to approval by resolution of the House of Commons before it be designated, and this House has an agreed process for national policy statements laid out in the companion, which is what we're following. Any further debate in this House would of course be a matter for my noble friend, the Chief Whip. On the TSC recommendations, as the Noble Lord pointed out, we agree with what the committee is seeking to achieve for 24 of the recommendations. Several of those recommendations are going to be addressed at a later stage, so through the development consent order, for example, or by other means such as the regulatory framework. We have published a detailed response setting out our approach for each of those recommendations. On the long-haul flights, the Noble Lord's right to point out the one net additional emerging market destination by 2050, and emerging markets are a subset of the long-haul routes. It's often more helpful to consider destinations served on at least a daily basis, as that frequency is especially important to business passengers. And the North West Runway scheme would lead to an additional 14 long-haul destinations being served daily by 2040. On air quality, our analysis demonstrated that the scheme can absolutely be delivered without impacting on the UK compliance with limits set out in the EU Ambient Air Quality Directive. However, it's not for the MPS to set out in detail what the legal obligations are. On community compensation, particularly for noise insulation, HAL's current public commitment is to contribute up to £3,000 for noise insulation. That commitment will be examined during any planning process, which follows the designation, if it happens, of the MPS. The MPS makes clear that the Secretary of State will consider whether the applicant has put correct mitigations in place before finally agreeing, at least to the level committed to in the Heathrow Airport public commitments. On community engagement, Rachel Sefentine, as I mentioned, has been appointed as the Heathrow Community Engagement Board. She's previously from the Independent Police Complaints Commission. The chair does not have any powers per se. The role is more of as an advocate through, and though independent, she'll obviously have connections with senior levels at DFT and HAL to influence where necessary. I met with her recently, and I believe she will do an excellent job of holding Heathrow to account. Turning to the points raised by the Noble Baroness Lady Randerson, on hub status, we do think that hub status gives us the best of both worlds. A large hub airport can compete for transport passengers to provide the connectivity which the UK needs, whilst at the same time enabling growth at other airports around the UK. On timing, obviously we will be working closely with the developer should the NPS be designated, and we've had independently and expertly appraised the timing, and as things progress we'll be working very closely on that. On costs for surface access, the applicant would pay in full the costs of any surface access required purely for airport expansion. If there are other benefits, then that will be discussed exactly how those schemes are funded. Again, going back to air quality, we've always been clear that development consent will only be granted if the air quality obligations are met. The environmental assessment and mitigations proposed by the airport will be very carefully scrutinised independently in public before any decision is made on whether to grant the development consent. The MPS outlined some of the measures that Heathrow may adopt to demonstrate these requirements, including a potential emissions-based access charge, the use of zero or low emission vehicles, an increase in public mode share by passengers, by employees. On domestic connectivity, one of the reasons why the government chose the North West One Way, it fully recognised the importance of air services to everybody across the United Kingdom. The Secretary of State set out as ambition for 15% of slots from a new runway to be used for domestic routes, and we expect the majority of those domestic routes to be commercially viable. I know that Heathrow are already in discussions with many airports across the country on that. So we do think in the first instance it's a commercial decision for airlines, and we will hold the airport operator to account on how it's worked constructively with airlines and regional airports to protect and strengthen the domestic connections. Heathrow Airport Limited have already set out a number of pledges to support domestic connectivity, including financial support for the new routes. But if those measures do not meet our expectations, the government can take action where appropriate to secure routes through the public service obligations. I hope I've got to everything. If I haven't, as I say, I will follow up in writing. The Noble Lord Tunnicliffe referred to 4 tests from the Labour Party, and I do think we'll meet them, meeting climate change obligations, protecting air quality, supporting growth across the country and addressing noise issues. And I hope that the Noble Lord and the Labour Party, once reading through all the documents, will agree that the revised MPS meets them.
I think it's the turn of our side.
This side.
I think it's the turn of our side. My Lords, I'd like to commend the government on finally making this decision. As one of my noble friend's predecessors, albeit 26 years ago, I can confirm the remark that the issue has been debated for half a century. I wasn't there all of that half a century. My noble friend Lord Spicer was there for part of it. The decision is the correct one. Heathrow is the only answer. It's all very well talking about putting other runways elsewhere, but you need the hub connectivity which Heathrow will give. And whatever the Noble Baroness on the Liberal bench says about hubs, they're absolutely essential, and it's what gives the people in this country the ability to fly to more destinations around the world than not having a proper hub, and this will do much to enhance that. So I really commend the government for having made the decision. I would like to ask my noble friend a question about this night ban, and I declare an interest as someone who lives underneath the flight path into Heathrow in West London. I know I live slightly further away than I did before, but I'm still affected by it. The Noble Baroness Lady Ranson queried the word expect a 6.5-hour ban. I hope we will be getting a 6.5, if not more, and I hope that it really will be a ban. At the moment, there is a sort of you're not allowed to fly within certain hours, except it can be at half a dozen in the morning or something. When they start coming in at 5 o'clock in the morning, that is what becomes really irritating. I hope my noble friend can confirm that this will be a real ban and there will be no flights, even emergency flights, between those hours.
My Lords, I thank my noble friend for his support on this decision. As my noble friend says, he is one of my predecessors, and I'm sure he was discussing it then, so it is great to take this step in laying the final national policy statement. We do need to take action now. Our latest analysis shows that all 5 of London airports will be full by the mid-2030s, and we are losing ground to our competitor hubs in Europe and the Middle East. On the night flight ban, absolutely, it will be a 6.5-hour, at least a 6.5-hour ban on all scheduled flights. We do think that there could even be more than that with predictable respite, and that's something which, once designated, will go to further consultation with local communities to agree the exact details.
The 20-year campaign to expand Heathrow covered also the period when I was a Member of Parliament for 2 of the West London constituencies. And I say to the noble lady, and it's a very important point, that of course some people are vocally against it. Very often, I have to say, the people who fly more often than anyone else as well, which came out in a number of constituency meetings I did in the area. But the important point is there are an awful lot of people who don't speak out clearly, who are desperately in favour of it. And the reason is jobs, and high-quality jobs. And indeed, when I've spoken in schools in that area, often the teachers, for understandable reasons, would be against it because of the noise. But when you ask the children how many family and friends worked at the airport or on airport-associated jobs, nearly every child did. So please make sure that we take into account the needs of those local people too. Finally, regions are incredibly important. You cannot expect the regions of Britain to do well unless they are linked into the hub airport. And on the issue of hub airports, it's quite simple. If all the other countries are developing hub airports and have got hub airports, there's a common sense question, why is it? And the common sense answer is because you need interchange. And interchange for Scotland, for Wales, for the south-west of England, which is often underestimated in this, do need links too. So please pursue this and take into account the crucial importance of jobs in south-west London and related areas when people answer these questions.
My Lords, again, I thank the Noble Lord for his supportive comments on this. Absolutely, this expansion will deliver jobs for the local areas. I think the latest figures are 114,000 for the local area, also 5,000 apprenticeships, which will obviously be welcome for young people. But we have not underestimated the potential impact of this decision on local communities or the importance of listening to them and doing it in the right way. I've personally met with some of the local groups who have been campaigning hard on this issue and I've seen firsthand their strength of feeling. The MPS does commit up to £2.6 billion towards that compensation and noise insulation and improvements to public amenities. But as the Noble Lord said, this absolutely does have support from those communities as well as opposition.
My Lords, I declare an interest that I live under the flight path and I belong to many of the community organisations that Baroness Sugg will have met with. I am appalled, and the majority of the community where I live in and surrounding communities will also be appalled by this proposal. So perhaps the Minister would confirm to me that it's very clear in the report the daytime respite periods will be shorter under this plan. It says in parentheses quite clearly in the page that those will be cut. Perhaps she would confirm that, and it matters because there may be money for insulation, but it's not very useful for children who want to play outside, people who want to walk outside or sit in a garden, and perhaps she would confirm that and tell us the number of hours we are about to lose of peace every day. That the airlines will be permitted to run a full service, and this answers Lord Brabazon's question, from 5:30 in the morning under this new plan. The nighttime ban is 6.5 hours, 11 p.m. to 5:30 in the morning. Currently, they cannot run a full service until 6 a.m. And this is done because, obviously, Asian governments are concerned that their residents are being disturbed by departures. And so instead, our local residents are to be disturbed by arrivals. And will she confirm, because it's also clear to me in the report, that the required noise level that the airport has to achieve is the level that was in existence in 2013, giving up 5 years of improvement? On actually surface transport, and I'll just be very brief, but all of the surface transport mitigations that are listed are those that are currently underway and in place to deal with the current congestion, the current overcrowding and the current air quality problems, the current airport and the forecast growth in demand in the local community. There is no additionality to deal with 41 million people and a doubling of freight and no indication of who is going to pay. And on air quality, frankly, they're just vague aspirations without any guarantees and without any clarity or, frankly, any targets. Would she confirm that?
My Lords, on the respite periods, the final flight paths obviously have not been confirmed yet, and I do understand why there is frustration in that. The proposals to change airspace design have to follow the new airspace change process. And that is something which will be done in the coming years in close consultation with the community. On the 6.5-hour ban, it has not yet been decided between the periods of 11 and 5:30 exactly where that will go. And as I say, that will also be done in consultation with local communities. And we do think that there could be more respite than that as well. And predictable respite too. I mean, obviously with a third runway there will be more aircraft movements in the sky, and so I do acknowledge that there will be more noise on that. We have, as I said, set out a comprehensive package of compensation which includes noise insulation and improvements to public amenities. On the surface access point, there's lots of investment to come on that. I mentioned Crossrail, HS2, and also looking at Southern Rail access and Western Rail access too. There are clear commitments to 50% of public transport use by 2030, 55% by 2040, and as I said, where that is directly in order to deal with expansion, that will be paid for by the developer.
My lords, my lords, my lords, my lords. I thank the noble Baroness for repeating the statement, which talks about ensuring timely delivery. One aspect of this will be a large number of legal challenges. What powers does the government have, if any, to ensure after due process that this very expensive and ambitious programme will continue, will be completed and completed on time?
My Lords, the noble and gallant Lord is quite right to point out that there may well be judicial reviews around this. Obviously, we are expecting that. We are still, the Airports Commission asked that the runway is delivered by 2030. As I said, Heathrow are working to 2026. We do have independent appraisals on that. And as I said, we'll be working closely with it. We will, of course, follow correct judicial processes on this. But we do, as I say, we'll work with Heathrow in order to get this delivered for 2026.
My Lords, what consideration is being given to use Manston Airport on the Isle of Thanet, particularly for freight, to relieve both Heathrow and Gatwick? I know it's some way from London, but it's easily reached by road and rail, both of which run alongside the airport, and the airport has the longest runway in Europe, I believe, and aircraft can go out straight over the North Sea and down the Dover Strait and into the English Channel.
My Lords, I know there's some very interesting proposals around Manston Airport. I mean, one of the reasons we did choose Heathrow was because of its freight capacity, and the expansion will deliver doubling of freight on that. I mean, alongside that, though, we are, as I said, already full at Heathrow and expect to be full at other London airports very soon. So alongside the laying of the final MPS, we also did announce the policy on making best use of existing capacity in order to ensure that other airports can do that.
So extremely good news. No, it is our turn, I think. It is extremely good news that this project is finally going to go ahead. But I do fear, as Baroness Randalson said, and I think the noble lady has already acknowledged the point, we may be running into quite a lot of obstacles and sources of delay. And if we do, I hope the government will consider proceeding by some accelerated legislative process so as to carry this through without undue delay. Undue delays in infrastructure projects is surely a great national economic handicap, which we've had for a long time. But will the noble lady agree that this is a particularly egregious case? We've had delays of at least 8 years due to indecision, vacillation, to setting up of quite unnecessary OTOs inquiries when the results of which were already known in advance, merely in order to delay the outbreak of conflict within the Conservative Party and disputes within the Tory Party and the House of Commons. And that's a very bad example, and I think that future generations in the international world as a whole would have noticed that on this particular occasion. Does she accept that had the last Labour government won the 2010 general election, and I declare my interest, I served in that government, but I had nothing whatever to do with civil aviation or airports. Had that been the case, and had we won that election, this new runway would have already been built.
My Lords, I welcome the Noble Lord's welcoming of the MPS. He's quite right to point out that this has taken some time. It has been subject to many conversations, which is why we are so pleased to be able to lay the final MPS yesterday. We do absolutely need to get on with this. As to whether this would have happened should the Labour government have won in 2010, I'm sure a lot of things would be different, but I'm not sure whether the runway would now be built.
My Lord, appetite to ask questions. Could I make a plea for shorter questions?
My noble friend, what is the future for RAF Northolt as this project goes ahead?
My Lords, I don't think this project will affect RAF Northolt. It obviously is a long-standing RAF airport, and the laying of the MPS and the future designation should not affect that.
My Lords, at the end of the Terminal 5 inquiry, public inquiry, which I was involved, we were promised there would be no further expansion of Heathrow Airport, and especially not a third runway there. In view of the fact that the Minister has just told us that there is going to be huge expansion of capacity at Heathrow, could she tell us how long we've got to wait before there will be plans for a Terminal 6 or even a Terminal 7 at Heathrow? Is there any end to the expansion there? And finally, could she relay a message to the Foreign Secretary and tell him that I'm very willing to lay down with him at any time, providing it's in front of a bulldozer?
My Lords, on further expansion at Heathrow, I do acknowledge that this that the third runway has been talked about for some time. The manifesto, the Conservative manifesto in 2017, did set out our support of it, and that we would be looking to proceed on it. I can say that I will pass that message on to my honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary.
My Lords, is my noble friend aware that I had mixed feelings about this decision? Having been the sort of house bore on the subject for many years, of course I'm pleased that we've moved with greater certainty towards a final decision on this matter. But it's got very late. And the position is now that whereas when I was Minister for Aviation in the 80s, Heathrow was by far and away the busiest airport in the world, international airport in the world. Now it's well down the pecking order, and my noble friend has today used the words, Heathrow is full. And then when sort of having to ask what we do about that, has sort of, I'm afraid, rather mumbled out that we'll look at other airports. The fact is that if we're going to have enough capacity in the late 20s, in this country, we're going to have to build a Heathrow Airport runway-sized runway in every single one of our London, certainly London-based airports, over the next 10 years. And this hasn't even really begun to strike us. So it's good news as far as it's happening, but it's terribly late, and we've got to do a lot of catching up now.
I thank my noble friend for his support. Again, I acknowledge this has taken some time, but we have now laid the final MPS. On other airports and reaching capacity, demand for aviation flights is growing and will continue to grow, and that's why alongside the MPS we also made the announcement of other airports being able to make best use of their existing capacity.
My Lords, I welcome this statement. It's been a long time coming, and of course it's a long way to go yet, even if Baroness Randerson is not right about the timescale. The Development Control Order won't be completed until early 2020s, according to the statement, and by the time it's actually built, it'll probably coincide with us moving back into this place. But I particularly support the encouragement of other airports, and in doing so, declare my interest as a board member of London Luton Airport. The noble Baroness, I think, is aware that Luton is already seeking to make best use of its runways and to build additional capacity. But can I ask about the planning system? Because all of this is putting a great deal of pressure, whether it's on PINs or local planning authorities. This statement will exacerbate that. What assessment has the government made of the capacity of the system to cope expeditiously with all the good stuff that could come from this?
I thank the noble lord for his support. I was pleased to visit Luton recently and hear about their plans, exciting plans for their development. On the planning process, we absolutely do believe there is capacity in order to do this. The scheme promoter is going to be consulting on the proposals before submitting their application, which will give people a further opportunity to have their voices heard. And then after the development consent application, the Secretary of State will consider it, but we are satisfied that there is the capacity to do that.
My Lords, make clear to us that the airport will be built with private capital. Will the compensation package be met by the airport? And will the other infrastructure improvements which are necessary be met by the government or the promoters?
My Lords, I'm happy to confirm that all of those costs will be met by the developer. The compensation package, the cost of the development, this will all be privately financed. On surface access, anything which is needed in order for the airport to expand will be met by the developer.
Can the President tell us what discussions the government is having with the devolved administration in Cardiff as to the likely consequence upon the land and nation of Wales of this massive development?
I'm happy to confirm that I spoke to my opposite number in Wales yesterday, who absolutely welcomed this proposal. They're very excited about it and keen for it to see it go ahead, and I will soon be visiting him to discuss it further.
My Lords, can I ask my noble friend how many more M25s, M42s, M6s, etc., are we going to need to be built alongside this airport, this new expansion at Heathrow, just to get the passengers to the airport or from the airport?
My Lords, my noble friend is right to point out that there will be needed some work on the roads. There is some information out there already on the details of that. As I said before, where it is needed for airport expansion, the developer will be paying for it. I also mentioned earlier about the targets of increased public transport for people travelling to the airport. And we have many investments in that already, and we do expect that to increase.